right. This is something that if we had more time in the semester, we would cover in much more detail. One of the issues is that I'm not sure who all's had the database course, so I can't delve too deeply into database processing. But I think based on my introduction last week and what I'm going to talk about this week, you'll be in a position to do these. Probably the hardest part of this, or one of the hardest parts of this assignment upcoming, is going to be the setup. So I'm going to set everything up on this machine, and but keep in mind that your installation is going to be a little bit different. This, for example, uses Microsoft IIS, where most of you are using XAMPP. So there's some variations right there. My plan is to lecture this week and to lecture next week, and to give the last week as sort of a catch-up week. So that's what my plan is so far. All right. I will post that to Canvas. So, okay, how can we connect to a database? Well, one of the things with XAMPP, in fact, the M in XAMPP is MySQL. And MySQL is I believe it's an open source database. Let me verify that. Yep, it is an open source database. Are you familiar with the word open source means, or the phrase? What that means is that the source code, in other words, the code that actually executes, that is the program, that makes up the program, the source code of it, in other words, the code that the programmers actually wrote, is made available for anyone to take and make alterations to. And then if your alteration is beneficial, they will add it to the release. So it's maintained not by Microsoft or some other organization. It's maintained by a community of developers. In a lot of aspects, as far as web development goes, there tends to be Microsoft and everyone else, two camps. And if you take CISS232, we'll talk about web development on the Microsoft side of things with ASP.NET and Microsoft SQL Server. This class is meant to be the other side, and that is, as far as the server goes, most of you using the Apache web server. We are using PHP, again, not Microsoft language, and we're using MySQL. So first thing that you will do is you will download MySQL. Now, if you have downloaded XAMPP, probably already have gotten MySQL. And in which case, all you have to do is make sure it's running. All right. I can't show you that because this machine doesn't have that installed, and it would really be a pain to install it. And there'd be a number of problems because this already has a web server on it. So I won't try to recreate it. But just as you start the Apache web server, start MySQL and make sure that's running. The second piece of software you need to install is called MySQL Workbench. And you can get it here. It's free. It's a tool for people developing databases to do things in a graphics mode. Not a graphics mode, but a user-friendly mode. It has a good user-friendly interface. So you could do things like create tables in the database, create databases, add columns to a table, change columns, delete columns, add data to a table, and so on. So you're able to do all those things through MySQL Workbench. So what we're going to use MySQL Workbench to do is to set up and initialize the database. Now, one thing I strongly suggest is that before you try to write your own code, try to run my code. In other words, repeat what I'm doing here, and make sure you have MySQL installed, make sure you have MySQL Workbench installed, and download run through what I'm going to do in the next few minutes. All right, and then test to make sure that my Office's example works. All right, because if that doesn't work, there's no sense trying to do more, right? Because there's something wrong with the setup. My code is proven to work if things are set up correctly. So if it doesn't work, it means things are not set up correctly. So you will download this. And this has already been downloaded on this machine. I'm going to go and open it up. SQL Workbench. You'll see a screen that looks like this. It'll say local instance of MySQL. And it'll give you the server name, which will probably be localhost. All right. And it says who is logged in as, and it's probably root. When you create MySQL, when you install MySQL, it creates for you a root account, and the root is sort of the, superpower account that can do literally anything on the database. And it creates it without a password. So typically you change it to have a password, and we'll show an example of that. But this is a local instance of MySQL, and you could have more MySQL connections if you were connected to a network instance of MySQL. All right. Each of these would be a web server, each of these blocks. We only have one in here, the local web server. So that web server is out there waiting for requests to be made for data. All right. So that's the server. If you don't see anything there, there's a problem. MySQL wasn't installed correctly or isn't running or something along those lines. So we're going to click on this to get into it. All right. And we get all this. We're going to spend most of our time here in the schemas tab. Schemas are, think of, the first screen had the database server. The schema defines the particular databases that you are running on this server. So you can run more than one database on a given database server. It could be, I'm not saying this would be a good idea, but it could be that human resources has their own database, and accounting has their own database, and finance has their own database. Probably isn't a good idea to do it that way, but you could have something like that. You could have separate databases for different functions. So we're going to click over to the schemas tab, and we'll see a list of sort of system databases that are predefined when you install MySQL. We're going to add one. So right mouse, create schema. All we need to do is specify a name. Now the name we're going to use is Classic Models. This is a database I downloaded from the web. I cited the source. It's from this MySQL tutorial, sample database. How do I know that the name of the database needs to be Classic Models? Because pull this in classic models database. So we need to do that. It also says that in my instructions for the lab. Classic models, use that. Okay. So we will create it. Give it the name, click apply. This will show you a SQL script to be run. All right. MySQL Workbench is largely simply a way for you to, in a user-friendly way, create the actual database commands. And why is this important to see the database command? It's important because you might eventually create a whole script that would create the database, populate the database, and so on. So you get to see the command so that you could save the command and include it in, for example, an installation process. But this is going to create the schema called classic models. That's fine. All right. Hit execute it, and we're done. So now we have a database or a schema called classic models. Our next step is to make it the default schema. So we can do that by right mousing on it and saying set as default schema. Now this doesn't have any tables in it, right? Because we haven't made any yet. So instead of having you type in data, I've provided you, or actually the makers of this example have provided you with a script, a little program that contains the database instructions to create the tables and populate them for this database. So I'm going to open up a query. It kind of gives you the first query for free. You can create a new query by clicking that. And I'm going to go File, Open SQL Script, and I'm going to navigate over to it and open it. And you'll see all the instructions in it. This actually creates a database if it doesn't exist. So you could actually skip that first step that I did, but it's no harm in doing it. It gets rid of the customer tables if it exists. That way, if there was an older version of it or something, it would get rid of it. It creates a table. It defines characteristics, the primary key, foreign keys, and so on. And then it does insert into, and it populates it with a certain number of these customers. To customers. So same thing, I'm going to click the lightning bolt, which says to execute the script. If you highlight one instruction, it will just do that one, but we want to execute the whole script, so we're not going to highlight any of them. You click that, and notice on the bottom it shows us what it did. Doesn't look like we got any errors, so we should be in good shape. Now we have, hit refresh, now we have some tables. And we can see the columns in those tables, or we can see data in those tables. Now, in the example we're doing today, we're looking at the offices table. So if you look, there's like 7 offices. All right, we're almost there. We're going to create another query. We're going to paste in this script. Change the password for the root to password. remember that you've changed it to password, because later on, if you go back and log into this, it'll prompt you for the password, and you need to put the password in. So password obviously is not very secure, but I'm using it to demonstrate something here. So I can paste that script in, execute it, and the way I have the screen resolution set up, you can't see the bottom, but it gives you a message indicating that it is done its thing. Okay, so we're probably done with this. I'm going to minimize it. Now we have our program, our web page. I'm going to keep a copy of it so I can change it later on if we need to. Now we have our code called offices.php that's going to retrieve all the offices that are in the database. So let me run it and show what it does. And we'll look at the specific code that creates it. Remember, when I create these, I deliberately create them bare bones, the examples. I do that so that it doesn't, additional stuff like formatting and CSS doesn't get in the way and obscure the guts of the example. So everything you turn in should look like a completed web page. So if you turn in something that looks exactly like this, you'll get points deducted because this is an example. I'm not grading it. Therefore, it's simple, straightforward to demonstrate and to show you how to do these particular operations. All right, so I'm going to type in localhost /offices.php, and there we go. We have a list of the city and the phone for all our offices. Now, if we were to add something to that, and this is the beauty of dynamic web pages. If we were to add something to that, if I had a Cleveland office, I don't know the zip code in Cleveland, so we'll make it up. So we go and we added that to the database simply by viewing the data and by populating the fields. Now, the next time someone requests this page, oh, I have to hit apply. This got me scared for a second. I hit apply. And then the next time someone accesses this page, there is Cleveland on the list. All right. So we don't have to change the web page at all. The code is written to retrieve all the values from the database from that particular offices table. And populate this table. All right, let's look at the code. All right, PHP, remember, is a mix of HTML and PHP code. All right, here's our PHP code. We have a try block. Those of you who have taken other programming languages may understand this. When we have a try block, what this does is it attempts to execute these statements. But if there's an error, it's going to catch that exception and display a message. Let's say, for example, I spelled classic models wrong. Known database, classic models. There, it showed me the error. Okay, so that's what this is. If there's any kind of problem, like we get the host name wrong, the username, password wrong, if our SQL statement is incorrect, if anything goes wrong, then it's going to execute this exception and display the message. Now, this is setting up our connection to the database. To connect to the database, you need to know the name of the host, the username in MySQL, that username's password, and the specific database we're connecting to. Well, the host name is either localhost or 127.0.0.1. Those two mean the same thing. 127.0.0.1 is the actual IP address for localhost. So you probably can put either of them in. However, I've had a problem when I put in the word localhost. And that might just be unique to my setup. But for that reason, I always use 127.0.0.1. Name of the username is root, unless you have set up a new user, which you can do in MySQL Workbench. I didn't take the time to do that. In an actual production environment, it would probably be a good idea to set up a different user so you're not connecting as the root who is, has superpowers in the database. Password is the password. DB is the name of the schema. So this line does the actual connection. This is creating a connection object to that database. Now, what do I mean by a connection object? It's like the pipeline that connects my program here to the particular database server. Remember, we have two servers at work here. We have the web server that's executing this PHP code, and then we have the database server that's handling the requests from the database. We have to create a pipeline, a connection to that web server, and that's what we do here. Or die means if we have a problem, display MySQL error. This uses MySQL I connect. Now, I'm not sure if you will have a problem with this or not, but I had a problem where MySQL I is a separate library and it wasn't installed on this machine. When I came in to test this yesterday, my code blew up. So I talked to the lab guy and the lab guy fixed it for me. So if you get something like function not found, MySQL I _ connect, then send me an email, send me a screen and send me the code. So when we make a connection, we have to supply these parameters: the host, the username, the password, and the database. Now, If I was doing this as an actual project and not just a standalone example, I would likely put that stuff in an include file, right? Because what if my credentials changed? What if I changed the user ID and the password? Would I want to go to all my pages and have to change it there? Of course not. So I would put all that stuff, probably these 5 lines of code, I probably would put in an include file. All right, here's where we're actually doing the query. So we're calling the MySQL query function using the connection that we made here. So we're doing that query on this database, on this pipeline. And the query we're doing is one of the simplest queries you can do in SQL. Select star from the name of the table. Star means select all the columns. There's no where clause on here, so we also mean all the rows. So this result is going to be an array. All right. Where each element of the array is one row that was retrieved from the database. And each column is going to be an element of that row. Sort of like an array of arrays. You know, each row is an array because there's multiple values for it. And the whole thing is an array because there's multiple rows for the multiple offices. Or die, so if it blows up, we get an error. All right, so now this results contains this array, which is a grid, right, with rows and columns. We're going to output the table, TRs, TH, and so on, for the city and phone. We actually retrieved everything, but we're only going to display the city and the phone. Now, we could have just said select city, comma, phone here, but I didn't. Now, while $x equals MySQL I _fetch array, what this is doing is this is looping through each of the rows. It's looping through each of the rows because that, what's the name of the variable? That result contains a collection of rows where each row has a collection of columns. We're looping through and we're getting one of these at a time. So as long as I can get something from that table, it's going to continue looping. So we'll grab the first thing the first time through the loop. We'll grab the second row the second time through the loop. The third row the third time through the loop, and so on. When it hits the end and there's no more things to be pulled, no more rows to be pulled, this condition becomes false. And we exit the while loop. So this loop works and loops as long as there's another row that can be grabbed from that result array. And we store the values of the row in a variable called x. So now I have echo my tr and td, my first creating a row in this table for each office, and we're pulling from that row the city attribute, which corresponds to the name of the column, city. We're then creating our NTD and creating another TD, and we're creating then a phone. we're getting the phone attribute, which is this one here. A lot of times you won't display the code, all right, because the code, usually is not of any relevance to the user. That's typically something that's used internally, but you could display it if it was, like if it was a customer number that your customers knew, you could display the customer number. So this loops and it creates a row for every row that it can retrieve from here. When it's done, it echoes, should be an end table, not a table tag. And we're done. How would I enhance this if I wanted to enhance the appearance? Well, this table is simply an HTML table we're creating. The only difference is we're getting values from the database to populate the columns. So I could do something like this. And again, since this is a standalone example, I'm going to create the CSS code right in it, but in a real environment, you would have an external CSS file. So I'm going to say something like table with 60 percent margin 0 auto. Just putting some style code in here just to show you that style code works for generated HTML just like it works with the HTML that you manually code. So just a little bit of formatting makes our page look like that. It's a lot nicer. You could put a header then on that, a caption tag for the table. So on. Now, my guess would be that most of the problems you're going to run into are problems that occur during the setup. That's why you want to take my example and test it on your machine and make sure that it retrieves the offices just like this did. And if it doesn't, then either try to figure it out yourself. If you are having difficulty figuring it out for yourself, send me an email. And again, maybe this is late in the semester to say this, but I will occasionally get an email from a student saying, I spent 16 hours looking at this problem and, and I can't, figure it out. I don't mean for you to struggle that hard on assignments. I want you to work, all right? but I don't want you to get to the point where it's just nothing but frustration and you're feeling you're making no progress and you're spinning your wheels. So if you run into something like this, setup can be tricky, all right? Especially given the fact that everyone has a different environment. There's people probably running Windows 10, people running Windows 11, people running Macs, different versions of the Mac operating system, all kinds of stuff could cause a little problem maybe with the installation or the configuration. So spend some time trying to solve the problem on yourself. Spend an hour, hour and a half if you're really ambitious, but don't spend time more than that. At that point, send me an email and try to figure it out. The stuff that can go wrong in the installation, we kind of went over the installation already. The stuff that could go wrong here is you could get one of these 4 variables wrong, but they should pretty much be the same thing for everyone. And it will be this, because you're pulling from the same database. You have to do the customers, I think. You have to do, pretty much it's going to be the same thing, provided you set up the database the same way. So one of these could be wrong. You could possibly not have the MySQL Connect library installed. All right. And if it says something like unknown function, that's probably the case. Your SQL statement could be wrong. Feel free to do this. If you really want to get ambitious, you can put an order by to say what column you want it sorted by. Or when you loop through, you could be asking for the wrong column name. Plus any other PHP bugs that you could have had on any assignment. So my suggestion again, first thing, try to do this quickly so that you have time to work on your assignment, all right? To make sure everything's installed, set up that classic models database and run my example. If that works, then actually creating this program should be fairly easy. Because you have to do the same thing for customers. It's just going to involve changing a few things around. Are there any questions about this? Next week, as I said before, I imagine will be my last lecture of the semester. And the last week will be for catching up. We're going to talk about AJAX, which is simply a different way of bringing together of having the client and the server communicate with each other. All right, if there's no questions, we will see you next week or see you in lab.